Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Highlights Podcast. I'm Erin King, and I thought that today we would unpack the super uplifting topic of grieving. It's Friday, a couple of days after my very favorite holiday, St. Patrick's Day, and my birthday's on Monday. So why not just dive into this super light, really exciting topic? But no, I've been unpacking two different books lately, and this is my very first solo episode of Highlights. And I figured that because grief and grieving is such an isolating and such a lonely experience, I figured why not do my very first solo podcast episode tackling this kind of tricky topic. So I've been reading a book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a psychologist back in the 60s and 70s. She is the gal behind the philosophy of the 5 stages of grieving. So her book was called On Death and Dying. She wrote a book called On Grief and Grieving with a fellow named David Kessler, who was her co-author and sort of her protege. Well, I heard him interviewed on his book called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief on Brene Brown's podcast. And if you're listening to this podcast and you are someone who is in a season of grief, which that could mean anyone in the world. We are still in a pandemic time here, COVID 2019, although people are getting vaccinated, which is exciting. We still have a long way to go before the world opens completely back up. So technically, if you are alive right now in this world, you could be said to be in some form of grieving or loss for either the way life was, the way your business was, the way things have been. But perhaps maybe you are someone who is facing down an actual loss. Maybe you have lost a child or a pet or a parent or a relationship. Maybe you've lost a certain professional opportunity that's making you feel like you're lacking. No matter where you are on that cycle, I want to share with you some of the insights that I've gleaned from both of these books on grief and dying to see if maybe they can help you to work through that process the way they're helping me to work through that process right now. So they always say as coaches that we should not ever teach from wounds, only scars. So I am certainly not in a position right now to be teaching about grief, but I am happy to share what I've learned kind of reading these two books as I'm facing down my season of grief right now. So I guess the point of this episode is to share some insights. If it will help you, that's great. If you have a friend in your life right now, maybe it's a parent or a sibling, or a partner or a friend, and you've just sent so many text messages saying, I'm thinking about you, I love you, I'm praying for you. And you're thinking, okay, I've sent the flowers, I've sent the card, I've sent the texts, but maybe you just feel helpless because you don't know how to show up for them in this season. My hope is that we can unpack some things in this episode that maybe you could forward to them and they can feel even more seen by you and even more supported and nurtured by you. So we're going to dive in. Okay, so what is this grief that I'm going through right now? For me, about 2.5 weeks ago, I lost my fur baby. So my Cavapoo puppy named Stevie Nicks, who was the love of my life. I don't have any human children, so she really was kind of my saving grace during this pandemic when everything shut down and we lost so much of our business. And she really just kind of brought the light back into my life and into our family's life. So she was hit by a car right in front of me walking home from our grocery store, which we've done 100 million times, just 2 blocks from our house. It was very traumatic. It was horrific. She died in my arms looking at me, and she really was the love of my life. So she was with me for about 6 months, full moon to full moon, and she was only 8 months old. So she was just a baby. So if you are a pet lover, if you're a dog lover, a cat lover, if you think about how much you love your human children, you know that it's really hard to lose someone that you are responsible for keeping alive, essentially. So for me, the last 2.5 weeks have been humbling. They've certainly brought me to my knees in ways that I did not realize were possible from a psychological and emotional standpoint. So anyway, After I drank all the wine in the Santa Ynez Valley and cried all the tears and didn't eat or sleep for about 2 weeks, I realized that it was time for me to start maybe unpacking a little bit and start to understand what this level of grief, like the deepest, saddest loss and this ache that you can feel as an adult, what can you do about it? So I started reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book. I read David Kessler's book. I listened to Brene Brown's incredible podcast. Definitely check it out if you get a chance. Where she's interviewing David. It is a beautiful podcast on grief. And I think just what I want to talk about today is what I've learned from these two books when it comes to love and loss and finding meaning. So let's start at the top. So let's say that you are someone who has had a loss or a tragedy recently, and you have everyone around you saying things like, well, there has to be a meaning. There has to be a reason. Maybe it was in God's plan. Maybe there was something that you didn't know that was going to happen in the future that could have been worse. People try to quickly, when grief takes us down and loss takes us down, they immediately are trying to find, that silver lining, that deeper meaning. And so for you, maybe your loss was over the course of the pandemic, and immediately everyone's like, let's find the silver lining, no commutes, more time with kids. We get to eat sweatpants and eat carbs. No one judges us, right? So there's all these like silver linings we try to find. Well, in David Kessler's book, Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief, he talks about the fact that when people are searching for meaning, essentially, immediate searches for meaning after you've experienced traumatic grief or a traumatic moment, it's essentially an attempt to bypass pain. It's an attempt to expedite the grieving process, to find a way to kind of shortcut through hell, essentially, emotional hell. And I have a quote from him that I thought was just really powerful. He says that every person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. Wonder why I'm doing a podcast. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. So I thought that was really beautiful, because I think oftentimes we really do. We try to find the silver lining because we're trying to expedite healing. We're trying to expedite the happy ending. We're trying to land the plane safely. But the reality is, if you don't feel it, you can't heal it. We can't heal what we don't feel. And so for you, whether you are in a season of an emotional breakup from someone, whether you've actually physically lost a loved one, either over a long period of time or suddenly and unexpectedly, or if you're still maybe grieving your former life in this pandemic, your former job, your former space, whatever you are trying to get over and move past, embracing the fact that we have to feel it in order to heal it is a brilliant way, in my opinion, for us to allow ourselves permission to let the grief do with us what it will. So the second thing that he talks about in his book is the fact that we also try to assign meaning to the actual loss itself. So, for example, we try to find like a reason that this death or this sickness or this breakup or this pandemic or whatever it is, we try to find a meaning as to why it happens. And I love what he says in this book, because he says that loss sometimes in life, it just happens. It's not a blessing. It's not a test. There's not a silver lining. He's basically like, in life, loss happens. And when it does happen, it doesn't always have a meaning. The loss itself doesn't always have to have a meaning. And what I love about that is he goes on to explain that the meaning that we can find from loss, the meaning is what happens in our lives after the fact. So ultimately, the meaning is in us. And there's no way to expedite that. There's no way to rush it. There's no way for you to chase it down and make it happen any sooner than it is ready to. And I will say that if you are finding yourself coming to the end of what feels like the appropriate amount of time to be grieving, and you're trying to expedite or force yourself to get through that process faster, I just want you to hear what he's saying, which is that if you don't feel it, you can't heal it. There is no way to bypass the pain by assigning a meaning too soon. And then finally, accepting the fact that the actual loss itself, in some ways, is just life. So I want you to think about that a little bit. I've been thinking about that certainly a lot, in that, for me, with losing my puppy, it's something where, okay, it's been 2.5 weeks. It wasn't a human child. Why am I feeling like it's getting worse? Why am I like crying in the shower? Why do I feel like I'm faking all my motivational speeches? Like, why do I feel like it's so hard? Like, even when doing the gratitude practice and your workouts and all these things, it feels so much harder to find that baseline of happiness that used to just be kind of like my natural set point. And I think that for all of us, to authorize ourselves to be clear that maybe there's not this like appropriate time period. There's not necessarily an amount of time that is acceptable, And here's the thing: is everyone in your corner, all of your friends, your family, your neighbors, your partner, they all want to take the pain from you. They want to feel it for you. And it's my hope that you are fortunate and blessed to have at least one person in your life that wishes they could just take the pain out of your body and feel it for you. Because I know I am certainly beyond blessed to have a number of people who have said that to me. And while it makes me feel so loved, and it really does make you feel supported, ultimately the hard thing about grief is that not only is it unexpected, not only does it come in waves, but it's also something that only you can feel, that only you can go through. And so in that way, kind of like being born and dying, because you're alone, it's a lonely process. So I just want to encourage anyone that's feeling that loneliness, and that maybe is judging how long it's taking them to bounce back, maybe even how they're handling it. Everyone keeps saying, be gentle to yourself, give yourself grace. And I think that there's a point where, yes, give yourself grace, be gentle with yourself. I certainly am trying to, and I hope that you are as well, with whatever you're facing down right now. And at a certain point, I think we do have to decide, are we going to keep treading water in these grief-stricken waters, or at some point, are we going to try to move towards shore? Are we going to try to find a life raft? Are we going to try to change where we are so that we don't let it overtake us, and so that we don't drown? So I think that the third insight I want to share that I thought was really powerful from both the podcast on Brene Brown's podcast, as well as David's book and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, The 5 Stages of Grief and Dying, is that I think a lot of us, if you are finding grief in a loss, oftentimes we will try to think about people who have a worse situation. So we will do comparative grieving. I remember in the moment when we brought Stevie to urgent care, I was covered, in her blood. And I remember in that shock, I couldn't feel anything. I felt nothing. Like I was literally numb with thinking I was in a horrible dream that I was going to wake up from. In that moment, I had the weirdest thought. I remember thinking like, okay, well, at least the blood all over me is not my husband's, like at least not my mom's or my brother, my sister, my dad, my bestie. Like I started thinking of all the people whose blood it wasn't, which is such a weird thing to think. But in that moment, I was trying to make myself feel like it wasn't that bad, even though it was so deeply traumatic. And so for you, if you're feeling like you have grief in your life, if you're feeling like you're mourning your professional situation, or you're mourning the loss of a relationship or a parent or a child, or whatever it is that you're mourning, and you're finding yourself doing this thing, this comparative grieving, where you're thinking about someone that has it worse. Yes, it can make us sometimes have a little bit of relief from that constant feeling, but also, it's also playing a losing game, because just like comparing yourself to people on the internet or keeping up with the Joneses offline or whatever, there's always someone that has the bigger house, who's richer, prettier, skinnier, more successful. And just like in grieving, there's always someone that has a worse story. And so I would just encourage you to avoid the temptation to compare your grief. For example, I've been, for the last 2.5 weeks, in the darkest place of my adult life. Now, I realize that immediately I feel guilty about that, right? Because I'm like, gosh, what a blessed life. The darkest you've ever felt at 38 years of age is that you lost your puppy traumatically in front of you. Like that's the worst grieving you've ever felt. Like how lucky are you? And then I started thinking about one of our friends, Brant Menswar, who's a brilliant author. He wrote a book called Black Sheep, which is all about finding your flock. And if you are looking to embrace your inner black sheep of the family, raise his hand, check out his book, Black Sheep. It's fantastic. And so Brant is going through one of the worst nightmares right now that you could ever imagine anyone going through. He just lost his son, who was a college-aged guy named Theo, who battled this horrible illness for years and years and years. Well, Brant is sitting here. He lost his son. He's mourning this every parent's worst nightmare after 9 years of battling this crazy illness. He's an entrepreneur. He has other children. He's running the family. He's keeping it all going. I mean, he is just he's an actual literal rock star. He's a musician. But you're looking at him like, wow, if he's still standing, like, get your shit together. Like, you should be fine. Like, look at what he's facing down right now in this season. And what I want to share with you is that you can hold space for both someone that you know in your life that has a worse situation without demeaning the reality of your feelings. So what I'm trying to say is if you feel guilty about the depth of your grief because in comparison to those around you, it shouldn't be this deep or it shouldn't be this bad, I want you to, and myself included, I want us to release that and not judge the emotion, because the depth of the emotion is the most authentic thing. And one thing I read in this book is that the worst loss you will ever face, is your own. And so Brant's level of grieving with this unbelievable horror and tragedy, and everyone in the country right now's level of grieving, the 500,000 people, the relatives of COVID victims, we can go on and on around the world. There is always a place you can find of a horrible tragedy, something that's happening that's horrible and bad and worse and worse and worse. And what I'd love for you to do, and what I'm going to do, is to make sure that despite that you allow yourself not to compare your grieving of losing a job, losing a parent, losing a sibling, losing a pet, not to say, well, it was just this. Don't demean the fact that that loss for you in this season in your life was traumatic, and not to judge it and compare it to anyone else's, because that's the burden that they're walking through. Yours is the burden that you're walking through. And you don't really have extra energy to expand on judging it and feeling guilty, because just battling the waves of grief that come at you, man, it takes every ounce of your precious energy. So protect it, defend it, guard it, and make sure you have it on reserve, because what grief will do is it'll hit you in waves like cleanup sets, and it will hold you under. So you have to be prepared to make sure that you're not wasting it in a space that is not going to serve your healing process. So that was helpful for me to kind of hear what he was saying in his book. I would say the last thing I'll share on this podcast is that when I was reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book around the 5 stages of death and dying, and then on David's book, he adds a sixth step around meaning, where Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's last stage of grieving is called acceptance. Well, he went a step further because David Kessler lost his 21-year-old son. And he had been a grief counselor for years and years. And until he lost someone of his own, his son, who was 21 years old, he never understood the pain that his clients were actually going through. And so that's when he realized that acceptance was not going to be enough for him. And so he unpacked a 6th stage of meaning, uncovering the meaning. And so what he suggests, as he's walked this walk himself, is that to uncover the meaning from your particular loss, the most important thing that you can do on a tactical, everyday basis is to remember to celebrate the smallest win. Celebrating the smallest wins that prior to your traumatic loss, prior to being in a season of grief, that would not even have been a win at all. So pre-Stevie getting killed, my win of a day looks very different back then, where it was all the things and all the meetings and all the milestones and all the checklists and all the meetings and all the people and all the accomplishments and the contenting and all these things. And your list probably looks similar. But after you experience a traumatic loss, traumatic grief, your definition of a win, it might just be that you go more than X amount of hours without crying. It might be that you don't cancel on your clients, but you show up to serve them. It might be that you allow yourself to eat the potatoes and the Irish soda bread and the corned beef and drink too much wine on St. Patrick's Day, whoever's, thing that was. But whatever yours is, it's allowing yourself to celebrate the fact that you're not giving up. It's allowing yourself to celebrate the fact that you get up and you realize you have a demon to face down again. When you open your eyes, that person or that loss will be the first thing you'll think about. They will visit you in your dreams. They will be the last thing that you see before you close your eyes. And it is a small win that you are getting out of bed, that you are practicing gratitude, that you are searching for the light. It's a small win that maybe you're not doing your workout anymore. Again, I'm not speaking from experience or anything, but maybe you're not doing your insane mountain bike ride or your spin Peloton bike or your big run or your push-ups. But maybe for you, a win now looks like walking around the block. It looks like putting on the shoes. Maybe a small win now is that you worked, you got through the day without crying. Maybe a small win is that you got through one meeting without crying. Whatever your small win is, recognize it. And what I don't want you to do, because I was doing this and I've stopped finally, but what I don't want you to do is when your small wins look like losses in comparison to what your wins used to look like, we just don't have time for that, not in this process. Your energy is fighting so hard to just keep you going in a stage of grief. So you can't waste any of that energy on that, well, I used to be able to do this. Because the truth is, it's a one day at a time process. Time will do its thing, but we have to keep showing up. And the best way we can make those deposits in our hearts to know we are actually making progress, as much as it seems like we're not, is to acknowledge that the things that are so small, the things that aren't that impressive pre the tragedy, right now, to honor those and say, good job, you. Good job, you. Good job, you. So I'd encourage you to do that if you are in a season like I am where you realize that every small win matters. So here's the final thought I want to leave you with here. The final thought that I want to leave you with, and I'm going to try and complete this without being too emotional. Not a good start. Is that when you think about the person that you lost, when you think about the child, the parent, the friend, the sibling, the opportunity, the life that maybe you used to have, whatever your loss looks like, I want us all to remember to focus on the fact that it would be worse if we never knew that person or had that joy or had that moment. It would be worse if we never got to see them or have them at all. For me, my baby girl I only had her for 6 months, but I know I would take those 6 months over 0 months. So it is awful to lose someone. It's awful to lose someone that you love, but how beautiful to have had the time that you had, and just to honor and respect and be grateful for that. You don't have to be grateful for the trauma. You don't have to be grateful for the grief. You do not have to be grateful that you're being taught some lesson or that there's some meaning is going to reveal itself to you. But let's be grateful for what that love, that person, that moment, that experience did teach us, because it really was truly beautiful. So that's what I got from those 2 books. And I hope if you're in a season of grieving and a season of loss, that you allow yourself that grace, that you allow yourself that time, that you don't search for meaning too soon. It will reveal itself in time, that you allow yourself to feel it, because if you don't, you can't heal it. That you allow yourself not to fall into the trap of assigning a meaning to the loss itself, because sometimes in life, loss just happens. It's not a blessing. It's not a test. The loss itself doesn't have a meaning. The meaning is what will happen in your life after. The meaning of why this happened to you is to be revealed within you when it's ready at the right time. The worst loss is always your own. So don't compare your loss or your grief or your dark path to anyone else's in order to minimize it or make yourself feel better. Honor the fact that this is real for you and that it's tough. And make sure you're celebrating every small win, one day at a time, because time will heal. Grief never goes away, but it will get better. It will get better for you. It will get better for me. And it's my hope that it will get better for us all. So that's my 2 cents, highlighters. My name is Erin King. Thank you for joining me today in this very vulnerable and personal podcast. And I pray that something that I touched on today might help heal your heart. I'm certainly hoping that one day it will start to heal mine. So Thank you all for being with me today, and I hope you have a beautiful Friday.